This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm doing a weekly review, weekly reads type thing, and I only have read 3 books. But when I go over what I'm reading currently, that might make more sense to you. Usually I read like 7 or 8 books, so this is a slow month, or a slow week and a slow month. I think I went from being 30 ahead of schedule for books to 22, 23 or something though, so I could afford to take a little bit of a break. The first book that I read was Tigana by Gavriel. This is a fantasy world. It is likened to like medieval, I think, Italian peninsula at the time, and so it's got like a historical fiction undertones coupled with fantasy and magic. It is got a very like deceptively easy concept that is very fascinating, and the most interesting thing about the story. It is about a group of renegades who are part of a kingdom that no longer ostensibly exists. When it was taken over, Tigana, this is a quote-unquote evil magician, decided to, because of personal reasons of what was afflicted to him, I believe his daughter or his son was killed by one of the people he held responsible in Tigana, and so relegated it to be completely diffused from the memories of everybody in the world, as well as even the inhabitants of the world. So, or of the kingdom, I should say. So he essentially created a group of refugees from the survivors of the kingdom that he went as far as he could to annihilate completely. And so these group of rebels who circuitously know of what happened to Tigana and want to exact revenge upon this wizard ruler person, assemble a band of people and go to do so. That's a very simplified version of what's going on with the story, but I think it's a really great hook. It's a concept that I haven't really seen in fantasy before. It is exceptionally fertile ground to work from, and then coupled with like historical underpinnings that might give it some gravity and hopefully some plotting that kind of like lends it some authenticity. But I have to say it was a book that exceeded my expectations. I still gave it 4 stars, yet still felt like it could have been far better than it was in more capable hands. I think this was a very early book under K to have been published, maybe even his first work, and it does feel like a debut in some parts. So the problems that I had with the book is all of the characters, again, from concept, feel great. They feel very like lived in, very cool. They have, just by virtue of being a part of the concept, and have like a very galvanizing reason to do what they are doing, and something that I can kind of get behind and root for. It also explores between some of the characters some very interesting ways in which the trauma of losing your home and your past and being a refugee, not kind of understanding but always yearning for a part of yourself that is never codified or codified depending on where you live, is very like poignant and well explored in some of the characters. Then as time goes on with this pretty long book, it was around 750 pages, I believe. I got it through Audible had a sale for it for like $5. And so the thing about it that I found is that they all felt what I've find and classify as my own little terminology is wind-up toy problem, which is the author imbues the characters with a motivation and then sets them out on this path. And oftentimes the race between the characters, in so far as you can codify like a character arc, feels like it should be interesting, but isn't. Go off the rails, off the hinges. They're not actually surviving the intent or the purpose of which they are given. And not all of the characters, 3/4 of the characters feel like that. They're just wind-up toys trying to get to a particular place, and they have no contradictions. They don't feel like wholly imbued with humanity beyond the revenge scheme and the particular role that they need to fulfill in the plot. Also, it feels very like what I would call classic fantasy, in that there's a lot of like machinations happening between the bed sheets that I just don't care about at all. It does a lot of stuff where it like executes the concept very well, but when filtering down to the character level, we start to go askew. For instance, one of the characters, a traveling musician guy, because the plot requires it of him, he leaves and goes about doing this revenge plot when really the justification doesn't feel all that well handled in the actual plot, or in the actual prose and in the argument as presented to the character. He just does it because it's required of him, basically. But that being said, he also doesn't feel like he's shoehorned or boxed into the typical toxic masculinity trope either. So there is some nuance being portrayed. It just feels like all of the characters, including the plot, are almost there. Like they're summiting the hill. They're almost interesting, but they never quite actually make it, for me anyway. So I could see how if I had read this when it was published, it would have blew my mind. But now all I see is all of these missed opportunities, these almosts that propagate throughout this text as it goes on. There'll be an interesting character, then we'll switch a scene, and it'll be like two characters we never met before having to hide in a closet, and them going through the most laborious dialogue ever for the sex scene to just happen in this closet. And it's like the most soap opera-esque scene ever, right after the concept and a couple other characters that were very interesting were introduced. So it keeps stymieing the enthusiasm that I had for the book throughout it. Yet, because of the concept being so strong, and the overall meta stuff occurring, I still quite enjoyed it. I just didn't think that his craft work or prose work especially did not live up to what I was hoping for. I was hoping for a 5-star book, of course. And so it just felt kind of like a disappointment, even though it does rise beyond the levels of most classic fantasy and certainly most formulaic fantasy. And again, the concept cannot be understated that it is exceptionally ambitious, very original in far as I know. I read a fair amount of fantasy, but not as much as other people who have reviewed it and loved it, so there's that to consider. But if you're consuming stuff like commercial fiction fantasy, this is a notch above that, I think. Just be aware that some of the tropes that we now think of as antiquated are certainly present and sometimes enunciated, like people screwing in a closet, saying, "Why did you tell me that you liked it dangerous?" Stuff like that. Next, I read Small Things Like These. I got it from the library. It took its time to get here, so I think it's quite popular, or maybe a combination of the library not having as many copies either. I don't know. Either way, this was quite good. I gave it 4 stars. This is a very small book, deceptively small, quite large print, 100 and something pages, and it's a lot more compact. It's like less than a digest size book, I think. This is a story in 1985, Ireland. A man with a family who's a laborer is kind of ruminating on the meaning of Christmas, the ingrained sensibilities of faith that is propagated throughout the town, and like hinges on the social capital that people exchange every day, is like kind of under shadow analysis, I guess. Like the man is very everyman, everyday, run-of-the-mill type of person in the town. And so I wouldn't say it's like a direct thinking man articulation of that, yet the plot and the thoughts of the man and how the interactions go in the town, especially with the nunnery. It's called the laundry. The laundry, I think it's just called in the actual town, work to really lie out sort of the phallus and, or not the phallus, the fallacy of people believing one thing but doing another, or looking away from a thing that is bad and still thinking themselves as good people when they're wholly hypocritical, of course. And when this man sees something at the laundry, which is, as far as I can picture in my head, a nunnery, basically, like an abbey, for women who don't want to be dealt with by their families, or they're disenfranchised or homeless, stuff like that. They've been cast out by their family, usually because they've gotten pregnant, probably not usually of their own volition. He comes across a girl who is being ostensibly punished, we can infer, by being put out in the shed and locked in there. And he's kind of confronted with what he feels he has to do. But yet, should he turn a blind eye to it, which people suggest, he could be rewarded in certain ways, and, you know, wouldn't be going against the grain. Everybody kind of, like, whether they believe it or not, asserts this line that the people in town deserve it, if they are in the laundry. And apparently this is like, so it is historical fiction, but it seems very well researched, and was something that I wasn't aware of whatsoever. So I quite liked it. I wasn't as enamored with the prose work as other people were. I found it kind of got out of the way, did its work, but wasn't really doing anything else for me. It's a short story. I definitely could see how it would be augmenting the Christmas season and opposing to more capitalistic ideas of around that, and how entrenched the churches in Ireland. It feels like a tandem piece to a whole bunch of other things, which, if you don't know about Christianity in Ireland, you gotta go read some other stuff on it, because it's a heavy topic that I can't speak intelligently about, but people should be reading about. So the next book I read was J.R. by William Gaddis. I did this buddy read with Mark Nash. If the video looks a little bit different, it's because I am recording this for the second time. This video was 15 minutes, and then it was 40 minutes after this. So I'm gonna try to be a little bit better at articulating my thoughts on this. So Mark Nash was a fantastic person to buddy read this with, because he had read the Recognitions and Agape Agape, which comes after this, but is very much present in this book, as I believe the Recognitions. A lot of the themes seem to be a carryover from what I've kind of gleaned from other people. And so this is a book about an 11-year-old boy, JR. It's definitely satirical, and one of the most effective satirical books that I've ever consumed, that's for sure. At least at a macro level it is. JR, 11-year-old boy, goes on a field trip. He, along with the other class members, buys stock in a paper company, I think, paper mill company, something like that, or a telecom company maybe. Regardless, wherever he gets it, he leverages that stake in order to sue the shareholders of negligence in some way, like a small loophole basically he's discovered, and essentially turns that into a empire, a family of companies, a first mega corporation kind of thing. Well, maybe not that big, but it's definitely where Gaddis is extrapolating to and where we've gotten to in society now, so it's very pertinent. There are multiple characters. It is densely packed, densely written, not because the flow is bad. It's actually extremely easy to consume and very accessible in that way, even though it looks very daunting. It is always walls and walls and walls of text because there are no breaks. There's no paragraph breaks, nor are there chapter breaks. It is just 2/3 dialogue, 1/3 narrative. And essentially what it means is that as a reader, if you're a visual person like me, all of my cognitive load was taken up by trying to generate the scenes in this, and such. It felt very cinematic actually to me. It is something of a catch-up book for me as well, though, because it makes me overdrive the sentences somewhat, so much so that when the scene changes, I feel kind of like floundering and have to regain my purchase and figure out who's speaking again, because everybody, since it is dialogue, while they are quite explicit about who they are talking to and thus tagging basically, it still feels like you have to self-generate the scene. There's not a lot of description happening. And when it does, it's like a breath of fresh air, though. Even though it is like a filled with run-on sentences when it is doing description or other kind of narration, it is exceptionally well written. The prose are fantastic in that way. And equally interesting is the dialogue, because it doesn't perform the function that you usually see in all other books. It simultaneously feels more organic than other dialogue everywhere else, and artificial, because he has to sprinkle in those thoughts about who is speaking and mannerisms, verbal tics, which signify who is speaking to the reader. But it still feels far more organic than most other books I think that you'd ever consume. So that's quite interesting. There's also no quotation marks and stuff like that, as you might have seen when I opened it. So it's a high cognitive load book, but a nice thing that it does is it's highly explicit in everything that it's doing. And by the end of it, it does feel like it all comes together, even though part of the intent is to frustrate the reader about capitalism. He wants you to be as pissed off about the noise of capitalism as he is. And I definitely was. I was ready to throw this book against the wall sometimes, because communication is key in this book. People are always being interrupted. There's ellipses everywhere. And gradually what you begin to see is that people are either a proponent of the artistic articulation of the human soul, or wherever you want to say art comes from, the confluence of ideas, the joie de vivre, the thing that people need to be doing and want to do in their life, versus the noise that is capitalism that stymies people from doing so, and reimagines them not as human people but as dehumanized cogs that function in society in order to self-fulfill the prophecy that is capitalism that never comes about. And so a lot of things that I noticed, there's a lot of reiteration about music, and the musicality of things in this book is very present. It is symphonic in its voices, but also often, at least in the 2/3, the rough going of the middle, I think, a cacophony of voices that become almost incoherent sometimes. And it becomes very frustrating, as mentioned, and that is the point of that section, I think. It is to center the reader in emotional anger towards these characters as they are subtly being produced and put into situations in which they are, again, either the proponent of artistic endeavor or stymieing it. And what gives them their nuance and their clarity as characters and their nuance is that they are constantly in situations where they are on one side or the other. So there's not one particular, there may be one particular like bad, some people are more bad morally than others, yet they function very well with capitalism, of course, and other people do not function well in the system and are able to be proponents of artistic endeavor. But everybody is noise at some parts in the story, and even the worst people are able to see the good in artistic endeavor at some points, even if they are working to commodify it, essentially. So this book definitely is prophetic in its views of where capitalism is going, where its nonstop onslaught towards commodification and what led to the gig culture, hustle culture, to essentially likening it to a musical game of chairs in which everybody, whether they know it, is participating. They all have to conform to the rules, and the rule is to win, and when you win, you have to keep playing. And the winning, the actual person that wins is basically the creator of the game, right? The person who tells people what the rules are and who changes the rules as things are done. So rather than have people point to that orchestrator, the conductor of the game, the point is to keep people so busy that they never see that they are playing the game and that they have to keep winning. And so the interesting thing about that is that every character, again, no matter how morally good we see them as, pays, because nobody escapes the machinations of capitalism. Even the people that conform to it and see the rules and try to win legally end up not in a profitable, good place eventually, because the system is exploitative. And people have such a short memory span, and the system is so good at indoctrinating young people, the generation to come after, to propagate its tenets and to continue the machine inner workings. Nobody is safe, nobody wins, everybody pays. And slowly what is happening, or maybe not so slowly, depending on what your age is and your position on the subject is, everybody's having to commodify every aspect of themselves, which is something that I know very well. My main hobby was tabletop role-playing game. Now I am doing that for money. The company that I used to work for no longer exists. And so the things that you end up liking end up becoming things that you have to rely on in order to survive. There's no subsisting and producing art. There's only the hustle that never ends, basically. And so there's a lot of explicit talk also of cybernetics, which breaks down into the systemization of things. And cleverly, all of the characters kind of become like ideologues in their own way, even if they're like everyday people. Everybody wants the ideas of the other person and to own the other person in some way. And that's all down to communication skills. There's a jab at communication skills in this book where JR, rather than go to English, which was renamed communication skills is on the telephone communicating, but what he's communicating is, you know, capitalism. Like he's embroiling everybody else, and throughout this novel everybody ends up working in one way or another for JR. And so there's just a lot of macro satirical stuff that really works. At a granular level, it's very mixed. There's some like the equivalent of dick and fart jokes that are happening, and then there's some stuff that you can tell would land if you knew more about certain subjects, but it is still accessible as a surface reading. I don't know anything about Wagner, but when it kept talking about symphonies and music, you start to discern when people are music and when people are noise, for instance. It becomes very discernible, even though when you're consuming it, it feels very like static and granular and making the same points about the characters seemingly over and over again. Yet what emerges is a lot more of a coherent thing, even as it is replicating the thing that is frustrating as an author within the text itself. So it's definitely, for me, it was a 5-star book. It was teetering between 4 and 5, but I admire so much about the macro level stuff and the intent of the novel, and even going so far as to put it, the frustrations, especially into the novel itself as you're consuming it, may or may not work for some people, but I admire it even after I go through it, even if I was kind of struggling with it in the 2/3 way. It is especially novel. There's a lot more nuance than what I am telling you about it right now. It is a book that I'm very happy to have read, and definitely happy to have read with Mark, who offered a lot of insights on what Gaddis was like, interested in at a personal level, and how they sort of manifest in this book. And it's just something that I empathize with generally as somebody who is a writer and a game designer and somebody who kind of like feels like I can't subsist and just be left alone to create my art and do what I want to do. Everything has to be commodified. Even if I start a new hobby, that gets commodified. Like when I was younger, I collected comics. I turned that into like a small business until the Canadian dollar dropped 30%, and it was just not viable to be buying comics and selling them again on eBay anymore. Everything as I grew up, as a child of essentially globalization, with internet culture finally reaching household numbers around like 93 or something when I was 8, it essentially made it so that, yeah, everything was a commodity, everything was systematized and commodified. And so now our culture is like entirely more schizophrenic even than some of the more extravagant characters in this book end up being from time to time. It is definitely antiquated, I will say, in its treatment of women. The women, though they get to be, again, proponents of artistic endeavor or just noise, are definitely still there as commodities to be possessed by men. And while he is kind of scathing in that notion, and the women do assert themselves sometimes, they still exist at the macro level to be interacted with at that level only. So that was something that bothered me, but something that Mark actually warned me about initially before we even started reading, because of the time period it was read in. And yeah, it is, again, if you're interested in something that is sort of like prophetic in its depiction of corporatocracy, the rise of the mega corporation, how capitalism functions, and it just on a like completely obtrusive and angry depiction of that, like a perfect condemnation of the thing articulated in form and function, you should pick up JR. And that's what I read this week. I'm also almost close to being complete up to the group with Scandinavianing about the books group read of Quixote. I won't go into that now because I feel like this video is going long already, but I think the humor is fine, a lot of dick and fart type jokes. Again, something that I appreciate on a macro level and not so much the granular humor that's happening basically, but yeah, it's good to be getting to this one finally. Anyway, that's it, and hope you're having a good week. Let me know what you've been reading. Any thoughts, opinions, put them in the comments, and I will see you later. Bye.